The 1960s did not end on December 31st, 1969. Cultural eras rarely respect the neat lines of a calendar. They linger, they fade, they rot. For the first 2 years of the new decade, the ghost of the 1960s was still haunting London. The radio was still playing the folk rock anthems of peace and love. The fashion was still dominated by the long hair, the denim, and the earnest, earthy aesthetic of the hippie movement. The dream of Woodstock, that a generation could change the world through communal love and acoustic guitars, was still technically alive, but it was on life support. The dream was dying, and the evidence was everywhere. The Beatles had broken up, shattering the monolithic unity of the pop world. The Rolling Stones' concert at Altamont had turned into a murderous nightmare, proving that the counterculture had a dark, violent underbelly. Jimi Hendrix was dead. Janis Joplin was dead. Jim Morrison was dead. The flower power movement, once a revolutionary force, had become a tired cliché. The optimism had soured into a grim, gray hangover. Britain itself was entering a period of darkness. The economy was faltering, strikes were looming, and the streets of London felt less like swinging London and more like a decaying Victorian ruin. Teenagers in 1971 were bored. They were tired of their older siblings' music. They were tired of being told to sit in a field and love one another. They didn't want peace. They wanted excitement. They didn't want reality. They wanted fantasy. They didn't want denim. They wanted glitter. They were waiting for a savior, but they didn't know what he looked like. They certainly didn't expect him to be a skinny, pale, failed folk singer from Brixton with bad teeth and a penchant for wearing women's dresses. David Bowie in 1971 was a man running out of chances. He was 24 years old, which in pop years was dangerously close to retirement. He had been trying to be a star for nearly a decade. He had tried everything. He had been a mod, a mime, a folkie, a psychedelic monk. He had released Space Oddity, a hit single that capitalized on the moon landing, but he had failed to follow it up. To the industry, he was a one-hit wonder. To the public, he was a nobody. He was living in a large, spooky Victorian house in Beckenham called Haddon Hall. It was a place of fading grandeur, filled with antiques and dust. In that house, surrounded by a court of misfits, designers, and musicians, David Bowie began to construct a weapon. He realized that if he couldn't be a rock star, he would have to play one. He would have to invent a character so compelling, so alien, and so dangerously attractive that the world would have no choice but to pay attention. He looked at the dying embers of the hippie dream and decided to pour gasoline on them. He wouldn't offer peace. He wouldn't offer love. He would offer the apocalypse. He began to scribble notes. He began to sketch costumes. He began to write songs about a doomed planet and a messiah who falls to Earth, not to save us, but to rock us. He was building a monster. He called it Ziggy Stardust. And he was about to kill the 1960s once and for all. David Bowie did not invent Ziggy Stardust out of thin air. He was a magpie. He was a cultural thief of the highest order. He stole from the best, and he stole from the worst, and he stitched it all together into something new. To understand the DNA of Ziggy, you have to look at the pilgrimage Bowie made in 1971. He traveled to New York City. At the time, New York was a rotting, dangerous, electric metropolis, the polar opposite of the gray, polite streets of London. In New York, Bowie saw the future. He met Andy Warhol at the factory. He saw how Warhol turned commerce into art, how he turned trash into gold. He realized that in the modern age, you didn't have to be authentic. In fact, being fake was more honest. He saw the velvet underground. He saw the dark, seedy underbelly of the city, the drag queens, the junkies, the hustlers. He saw that there was a beauty in decay, and crucially, he saw Iggy Pop. Iggy Pop was the lead singer of the Stooges. He was primal, he was terrifying. He would roll around in broken glass on stage. He would vomit on the audience. He was pure, unadulterated chaos. Bowie was mesmerized. He saw in Iggy Pop a man who had completely surrendered to the demon of rock and roll. Bowie took mental notes. He took Iggy's name, changing the Pop to Stardust in honor of another obscure eccentric, the legendary Stardust Cowboy. He took Iggy's danger. He took Lou Reed's street poetry. But he needed a tragic flaw. He found it in the story of Vince Taylor. Vince Taylor was a British rocker from the late 50s who had tasted success and then descended into madness. Taylor had a breakdown, convinced he was a god, an alien, a messiah. He famously came out on stage in white robes and declared he was Jesus Christ. His career evaporated instantly. Bowie was fascinated by this leper messiah, the idea of a rock star who believes his own myth, who is destroyed by the very fans who worship him, became the central tragedy of the Ziggy Stardust narrative. So he had the concept, a doomed alien rock star who acts as a conduit for extraterrestrial messages in the last 5 years of Earth's existence. But a concept is just a daydream without a sound. Bowie was an acoustic strummer. He needed muscle. He needed a band that could play the soundtrack to the apocalypse. He found his sonic weapon in the most unlikely place. Hull, a tough industrial port town in the north of England. He recruited 3 musicians who would become the Spiders from Mars. On bass was Trevor Bolder, on drums was Woody Woodmansey, and on guitar was the secret weapon, the man who would define the glam rock sound, Mick Ronson. Mick Ronson was a virtuoso. He was a working-class guy who looked like a Greek god and played guitar like a chainsaw cutting through velvet. He was the perfect foil for Bowie. Bowie was the brain. Ronson was the guts. Bowie was the alien. Ronson was the human anchor. But there was a problem. These were tough northern men. They liked pints of bitter and denim jeans. They were not glam. Bowie had to transform them. It was a process of coercion. He told them, "If you want to be stars, you have to look like stars." He put them in costumes. He gave them sequins. He forced them into high-heeled boots. There are legendary stories of the Spiders grumbling in the dressing room, terrified that if they walked into a pub in their hometown wearing these outfits, they would be beaten up. But the final piece of the puzzle was the hair. In early 1972, Bowie walked into a salon and showed his stylist a magazine photo. It was a picture of a model wearing clothes designed by Kansai Yamamoto, but it was the setting that mattered. The photo looked like something out of A Clockwork Orange, the dystopian film by Stanley Kubrick that had just been released. Bowie wanted the violence of the droogs. He wanted a haircut that said danger. The stylist cut his long, hippie locks off. She created a spiked, jagged mullet. Then she applied the dye. Schwarzkopf red. When David Bowie looked in the mirror, David Bowie was gone. The pale folk singer had vanished. Staring back at him was a creature with flame-red hair, pale skin, and eyes that looked like they had seen the end of the world. The ingredients were mixed. The monster was ready. Now he just needed a stage to frighten the world. In the early months of 1972, David Bowie and the Spiders from Mars entered Trident Studios in Soho to record the manifesto that would define the decade. The album was titled The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars. It was a cumbersome, Victorian-sounding title, but the music inside was streamlined, hard, and shiny. If the 1960s had been about albums, long, sprawling, psychedelic journeys meant to be listened to while lying on a beanbag in a haze of marijuana smoke, Ziggy Stardust was a return to the sharp, punchy danger of 1950s rock and roll, but filtered through the lens of a sci-fi dystopia. The album opens not with a bang, but with a slow fade-in, a drum beat that sounds like a heartbeat, then a piano, and then the voice. Pushing through the market square, so many mothers sighing. The song is 5 years. In the fictional universe of the album, the news has just broken. Earth has 5 years left before it is destroyed. The resources are gone. The end is nigh. This was the masterstroke of the narrative. The hippies had promised the age of Aquarius, a new dawn of spiritual enlightenment. Ziggy Stardust promised the apocalypse. It resonated perfectly with the mood of 1972. The Cold War was freezing. The economy was crashing. The utopian dream was dead. Bowie didn't try to sell hope. He sold a glamorous party at the end of the world. The character of Ziggy, as described in the songs, is not a hero. He is a leper messiah. He is vain. He is well hung and snow-white tan. He plays guitar left hand. He is a composite of every rock star cliché, inflated to the point of absurdity. He is a star who believes his own hype, eventually alienating his band and getting torn to pieces by his own fans in rock and roll suicide. The sound of the album was the sound of Mick Ronson. While Bowie provided the theatrical vocals and the acoustic strumming, Ronson provided the crunch. His Les Paul guitar, played through a Marshall amplifier with a half-cocked wah-wah pedal, created a thick, nasal, aggressive tone that cut through the mix like a laser. It was the sound of glam rock being invented in real time. It was dirty, sexy, and loud. But despite the genius of the concept and the ferocity of the band, the album initially faced a hurdle. It lacked a single. The executives at RCA Records heard the tapes and they were worried. They heard a lot of high-concept art rock. They heard songs about Suffragette City and Moonage daydreams. But they didn't hear a radio hit. They didn't hear the song that would get the kids into the record shops. They told Bowie, "We need one more." So David Bowie sat down and wrote a song that was explicitly designed to be the bridge between the alien and the human. He wrote Starman. Starman is a musical anomaly on the album. It is lighter, softer. The chorus, "There's a starman waiting in the sky," is a direct melodic lift from somewhere over the rainbow. It is a lullaby. But lyrically, it is the key to the whole myth. In the song, the starman isn't invading, he isn't attacking, he's waiting. He wants to come and meet us, but he thinks he'll blow our minds. He is a benevolent alien sending a message of hope through the radio to the bored teenagers of Earth. Let all the children boogie. That was the command. It wasn't fight the power. It wasn't stop the war. It was boogie. It was permission to dance in the face of doom. The album was released on June 16, 1972. The reviews were generally good. The critics recognized that Bowie was doing something new, but the public was still confused. The band went on tour to support the album, playing small halls and pubs across the UK. The reaction was often one of baffled hostility. Picture the scene. A crowd of British men in denim jackets, holding pints of beer, expecting a blues band or a folk singer. Instead, out walks a man with bright red hair, wearing a quilted jumpsuit, knee-high wrestling boots, and makeup. He looked like a creature from another species. He was effeminate yet aggressive. He was fragile yet commanding. For the first few weeks, it seemed like Ziggy Stardust might remain a cult curiosity, a weird art project for the London elite. It needed a spark. It needed a moment of transmission. It needed to be beamed directly into the living rooms of the unsuspecting public. And in July 1972, fate intervened. A slot opened up on the BBC's flagship music program, Top of the Pops. Top of the Pops was not just a TV show. In 1972, Britain, with only 3 television channels available, it was a religious institution. Every Thursday night, millions of families, mums, dads, and teenagers, sat down around the television to watch the countdown of the week's hits. It was the monoculture. David Bowie and the Spiders from Mars were invited to perform Starman. They packed their instruments. They put on their makeup. They zipped up their jumpsuits. They were about to step onto the most important stage in the country. Bowie knew this was his chance. He knew that he had 3 minutes to seduce a nation. He wasn't just going to sing a song. He was going to make love to the camera. July 6, 1972, a Thursday. To understand the magnitude of what happened on this night, you have to visualize the setting. You have to imagine the interior of a standard British living room in the early 1970s. It is beige. It is brown. It is wallpapered with floral patterns. The air is thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of fried dinner. It is a world of conformist normality. Sitting on the sofa are the parents, men who likely fought in the war or grew up in its shadow, women who were raised on rationing and modesty. Sitting on the floor are the children, teenagers who are bored, restless, and starving for color. In the corner sits the television set. It is the hearth of the modern home. For 40 minutes a week, Top of the Pops is the only thing that matters. It is the window into the glamorous world of pop culture. At approximately 7:25 p.m., the host introduces the next act. The cameras cut to the studio floor, and suddenly, the beige living room is invaded. David Bowie appears. He is wearing a quilted, multicolored jumpsuit that clings to his skeletal frame like a second skin. It is open at the chest. He is wearing red patent leather wrestling boots. His hair is a shock of violent orange fire. He is holding a blue acoustic guitar. He looks like nothing these people have ever seen before. He doesn't look like a man. He doesn't look like a woman. He looks like an insect. He looks like a creature that has fallen from a spacecraft and landed directly on the BBC soundstage. Behind him stands Mick Ronson, looking like a peroxide blonde Greek god in a gold suit, and the rest of the Spiders, chewing gum and looking distinctively menacing. The music starts. The gentle strum of the acoustic guitar. Bowie leans into the microphone. He doesn't shout. He smiles. It is a conspiratorial smile, a smile that says, "I know something you don't know." He sings the opening lines of Starman. Didn't know what time it was. The lights were low. When he gets to the line, "I had to phone someone, so I picked on you," he points a long, manicured finger directly at the camera. In millions of living rooms, teenagers gasp. He isn't pointing at the audience in the studio. He is pointing at them. He is singling them out. It is a moment of direct recruitment. He is saying, "You, the odd one, the lonely one, I am here for you." But the true shock, the moment that would be debated in schoolyards and factories the next morning, comes during the chorus. As the song swells into the la 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 refrain, David Bowie steps away from the microphone. He walks over to Mick Ronson. Mick Ronson is the visual anchor of the band. He is the tough northern guitar hero. He represents the masculine ideal of the rock star. Bowie drapes his arm around Ronson's shoulders. It isn't a friendly pat on the back. It is a caress. He pulls Ronson close. He looks into Ronson's eyes. He sings into Ronson's microphone. For a few seconds, the two men are locked in an intimate embrace. The alien and the bricklayer, the androgen and the tough guy. The reaction in the living rooms of Britain was instantaneous and polarized. Fathers were appalled. They shouted at the television. They called him names. "Look at that. Is it a boy or a girl? It's disgusting. Turn it off." But the children were mesmerized. For a generation of future stars, this was their moon landing. Gary Kemp of Spandau Ballet later said, "It was the moment the world changed from black and white to color." Boy George said, "I saw him and thought, that's me." Morrissey, the future lead singer of the Smiths, sat in Manchester and realized that being different wasn't a curse. It was a superpower. Bono of U2 has described it as the moment he realized that rock and roll wasn't just about music. It was about liberation. Bowie had broken the code. In one gesture, he had dismantled the rigid, macho posturing of rock music. He had introduced ambiguity. He had introduced sexuality. He had introduced the idea that you could be whoever you wanted to be. The performance lasted barely 3 minutes. But when it was over, the 1960s were officially dead. The era of denim and authenticity was over. The era of glitter, artifice, and identity politics had begun. The next day, the single Starman flew off the shelves. The album Ziggy Stardust began its climb up the charts. The tour, which had been playing to half-empty halls, was suddenly sold out. Ziggy Stardust was no longer a fictional character written in a notebook in Beckenham. He was real. He was a celebrity. He was a god. But David Bowie had made a dangerous bargain. He had created a character to save his career, but he had done it so well that the character was beginning to consume him. The fans didn't want David Jones. They didn't want David Bowie. They wanted Ziggy. They wanted the alien. And as the tour grew bigger, and the screaming got louder, and the drug intake increased, the line between the man and the mask began to blur. David Bowie had invited the Starman down to Earth. Now he had to live with him. The transmission was successful. The signal had been received. And almost overnight, the world began to reshape itself in Ziggy Stardust's image. The reaction to the top of the pops performance wasn't just applause. It was imitation. At concerts across the UK, the audiences transformed. The denim-clad students disappeared, replaced by thousands of Ziggy clones. Teenagers raided their mothers' makeup bags and their grandmothers' wardrobes. They chopped their hair into jagged mullets and dyed them orange with food coloring. They painted lightning bolts on their faces. David Bowie looked out from the stage and saw a mirror. He had created an army of aliens. But as the success grew, so did the distortion. The fiction of Ziggy Stardust was designed to be a story about a rock star who was destroyed by his own fame. And now, in a terrifying case of life imitating art, David Bowie was beginning to live that destruction. The Ziggy persona was not a mask that he could easily take off. It was a total immersion. Bowie spoke as Ziggy in interviews. He ate as Ziggy. He slept as Ziggy. The shy, soft-spoken David Jones from Brixton was being suffocated by the arrogant, icy Martian messiah. "I fell in love with Ziggy," Bowie later admitted. "It was quite easy to become obsessed night and day. I became Ziggy Stardust." David Bowie went out the window. "Everybody was convincing me that I was a messiah, especially me." The band, the Spiders from Mars, were swept up in the madness. They were no longer just musicians from Hull. They were international superstars. They toured America, a country that Bowie had previously only visited as a tourist. Now he was conquering it. The American tour was a blur of excess. The venues got bigger. The screaming got louder. The drugs got harder. Bowie, famously terrified of flying, traveled across the vast continent by train or limousine, isolating himself further from reality. He became a creature of the night. Living on a diet of cocaine, milk, and red peppers, he was becoming skeletal, paranoid, and fragile, exactly like the character he had written. The shows were no longer just concerts, they were religious rituals. During Rock and Roll Suicide, the closing number, Bowie would reach out his hands to the audience, pleading, "Give me your hands, 'cause you're wonderful." The fans would surge forward, clawing at him, trying to touch the hem of his garment. They pulled at his clothes. They pulled at his hair. They wanted a piece of him. It was the leper Messiah prophecy coming true. The fans loved him to death. By 1973, the cracks were showing. The album Aladdin Sane was released. Essentially, Ziggy Goes to America, featuring the iconic lightning bolt portrait. It was a massive hit, but the music was darker, more jagged, more frantic. It sounded like a man on the edge of a nervous breakdown. The Spiders from Mars were exhausted. They had been touring non-stop for 18 months. They were rich, yes, but they were burnt out. And there was tension. They were the engine room of the sound, but Ziggy was the star. They felt the separation. But the biggest toll was on Bowie's mind. He began to fear that he was going insane. He couldn't distinguish between the applause for the character and the love for himself. He felt hollowed out, a vessel for a fictional ghost. He realized that he had built a trap. Ziggy Stardust had made him a legend, but if he stayed Ziggy Stardust, he would die. He would become just another casualty of rock history, another Vince Taylor, another Sid Vicious in the making. He had to make a choice. To save David Bowie, he had to commit murder. He kept the plan a secret. He didn't tell the record label. He didn't tell the promoters. Crucially, and perhaps cruelly, he didn't even tell the band. The date was set. July 3rd, 1973, the final show of the tour. The venue was the Hammersmith Odeon in London. It was billed as a homecoming triumph. The cameras were rolling, directed by D.A. Pennebaker, to document the event. The atmosphere was electric. The streets outside were gridlocked with fans. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation. The Spiders played with a ferocity born of exhaustion. Mick Ronson's guitar screamed. Trevor Boulder's bass throbbed. Woody Woodmansey's drums thundered. Bowie was perfect, strutting, preening, seducing the crowd one last time. But as the concert neared its end, the mood changed. The set list finished. The band left the stage, then returned for the encore. The crowd roared. They expected Rock and Roll Suicide. They expected the ritual. Instead, David Bowie walked to the microphone. He looked pale. He looked serious. The smile was gone. He waited for the silence to settle over the 3,000 people in the dark. He took a breath, and then he delivered the eulogy. The date was July 3rd, 1973, the Hammersmith Odeon. The air inside the theater was hot, depleted of oxygen, and thick with the smell of patchouli, sweat, and anticipation. 3,000 fans, their faces painted with lightning bolts, stared up at the stage. They had witnessed a triumph. They had seen the Starman at the peak of his powers. They were screaming for an encore. David Bowie walked to the center of the stage. He stood before the microphone, his chest heaving, the sweat causing his makeup to run. He looked out at the sea of adoration he had created. He looked at the monster, and he raised his hand for silence. The roar of the crowd died down. They expected a thank you. They expected a tour announcement. Instead, David Bowie leaned in and spoke the most famous words in rock history. "Of all the shows on this tour, this particular show will remain with us the longest," he said, his voice soft, almost trembling. "Because not only is it the last show of the tour, but it's the last show that we'll ever do." For a second, the sentence hung in the air, misunderstood. Did he mean the last show of the year? The last show in London? Then, the realization hit. The silence was shattered by a collective scream of denial. "No!" the voices cried out from the dark. Girls began to weep. People grabbed their heads. It felt like a physical blow. They were witnessing the death of their god in real time. But the most shocked people in the building weren't in the audience. They were standing behind him. Woody Woodmansey, the drummer, and Trevor Bolder, the bassist, looked at each other in total confusion. Bowie hadn't told them. He hadn't warned them that he was firing them on stage in front of 3,000 people. They learned they were unemployed at the exact same moment the fans learned Ziggy was dead. It was a moment of cold, ruthless ambition. Bowie was cutting the cord. He was jettisoning the rocket boosters so the capsule could continue its flight. Ignoring the chaos, Bowie turned to Mick Ronson. He nodded. Ronson, who was in on the secret, played the opening chord of Rock and Roll Suicide. It was the perfect eulogy. The song is a desperate anthem about a star burning out, about the fragility of life. When Bowie sang the final crescendo, "You're not alone. Give me your hands," it wasn't a celebration anymore. It was a goodbye. He reached out to the audience one last time, not to take their love, but to give it back. He was telling them that they didn't need him anymore. The transmission was complete. The song ended. The band crashed out the final chord. Bowie bowed, turned, and disappeared into the shadows. Backstage, the atmosphere was a funeral wake. The Spiders were furious and heartbroken. The fans outside refused to leave, chanting Ziggy's name into the night. But Ziggy wasn't there. David Bowie sat in his dressing room, wiping the orange powder from his face, stripping off the alien skin. He was already thinking about the next move. The next morning, the headlines screamed, "Bowie quits." The world thought he had retired from music. They were wrong. He hadn't killed David Bowie. He had assassinated Ziggy Stardust to save David Bowie. In the years that followed, Bowie proved that Ziggy was just one mask in a drawer full of them. He became the dystopian rebel of Diamond Dogs. He became the plastic soul crooner of Young Americans. He became the icy, aristocratic, thin white duke. He moved to Berlin and reinvented electronic music. He proved that in pop culture, the only way to survive is to change. But the ghost of Ziggy Stardust never really left. The impact of that 18-month period was seismic. Ziggy Stardust killed the 1960s dream of authenticity. The hippies had believed that rock music had to be real, that you had to wear denim and sing about your feelings. Ziggy proved that fake could be just as powerful. He proved that artifice could be true. He taught a generation of teenagers that identity wasn't something you were born with. It was something you created. You could be a boy from the suburbs of London and invent yourself as a Martian. You could change your hair, your clothes, your gender presentation, and your name. Without Ziggy Stardust, there is no Johnny Rotten. The Sex Pistols were formed on equipment stolen from the Ziggy farewell gig. Without Ziggy Stardust, there is no Boy George, no Madonna, no Lady Gaga. Without Ziggy Stardust, the gray, masculine world of the 1970s would have remained monochrome. David Bowie died in 2016, returning to the stars from which he claimed to have fallen. But back in 1972, he did something that few artists ever achieve. He looked at the world, saw it was boring, and decided to paint it in his own colors. He killed the flower child. He birthed the glitter generation. And he left us with a simple, enduring message, broadcast from a TV screen on a Thursday night. You are not alone. And if you don't like who you are, you can always be someone else. The Starman has gone, the spiders have dispersed, but look around at the culture of today. The fluidity, the theatricality, the freedom. We are all still living in the world that Ziggy built. These are the stories that define our culture. The moments where the mask slips, the myths are born, and the music changes forever. If you want to keep exploring the history of the legends with us, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We have so many more lives to live.